join across classes. We've got multiple history classes here represented. We've got English classes here. So this is very exciting to see that we're all here in one place. I do want to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Jonathan Freund. Mr. Freund is the director of the Holy Land Democracy Project. And I met him because I actually was a participant in a trip to Israel and an educational experience where I got to learn about the history of Israel and the political context of what's going on in the Middle East right now. And so Mr. Freund was our host on that trip. He has been an educator in areas of the Holocaust, Judaism, and Israel for over 15 years. And he is a regular guest lecturer in high schools across the LA area, as well as colleges. He has been a guest instructor at the Interreligious Dialogue and Leadership program at the Claremont School of Theology. And today you have the privilege to hear a little bit about his own family history and how they were affected by rising discrimination in the context of pre-war Germany. So it's sort of right on the cusp of the outbreak of World War II. So we're going to hear a little bit about what his family experienced. So Mr. Freund, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, all of you, and thank you to students for this opportunity. That was a great introduction, so let me just get rolling since we will have limited time. Oh,
I'm so sorry. Can I interrupt?
Sure.
I'm so sorry. I just wanted to remind all of you students, you should be taking notes. I assume all of your teachers will ask you to upload a photocopy of your notes or a photo of your notes. And also be thinking about maybe 1 or 2 questions that you could ask Mr. Freund. We will certainly not have time for questions from all of you, but we'll have a time for a question and answer towards the end. And at that time, we'll let you know, okay, there will be a place where you can type in Okay, so sorry. Thanks.
Okay, so here we go. I will share my screen and, well, actually, hold on. I will, oh yeah, that's the last time. I'll share my screen and we will get rolling, all right? Now, okay. So I'm going to talk about the Holocaust. I know many of you or all of you have done some studying about the Holocaust, or maybe a lot of studying. I don't know exactly what you have covered. I imagine it's very historical, sort of a broad range within the context of World War II. And you may have read Anne Frank. So you've had at least one person's story of what it was like to be in hiding, which was one of the ways that Jews had to do to at least try to survive. I'm going to talk to you about my family and try to focus just on this one family's experience and to move on from there. So this is my grandmother, Annalisa, my father's mother, in 1902. She was born in 1902, so this is probably 03 or 04, maybe at most. And as you can see, she comes from a large and well-off family. I don't really know who everyone else is in that photograph, except for her mother, obviously, and her brother, who's down here on the lower part. This is her grandmother. I don't really know who the other people are. These are probably servants or governesses, what we would know as housekeepers. This is probably her uncle. I don't see anyone that looks like her grandfather. I have other, or her father. I have other photos. Anyway, as you can see, wealthy, well-off family. You can tell by the clothes, the wall, the number of people. They're keeping a dog, which not everyone could. So that's my grandmother, Annalisa. This is how Annalisa was with her family. Again, you see how well-to-do they were. They were able to have a lot of photographs in their life taken, and I have a lot of, not everyone could do. Um, and um, They have these costumes, these bizarre costumes, these lederhosen, as they were called, what the boys are wearing. They did not dress like that all the time. Um, but as you can see, Annalisa had a lot of portraits taken of her. She was quite an attractive young woman. Um, this is another family, and uh, German Jewish family. This is in Berlin, and this is Kurt Freund, who is my grandfather. And he was born in 1898. This picture, I don't know, he looks about 8, maybe 10. So it's probably 1906, 1908, this picture was taken. The other people in the photograph, and again, well-to-do family, very nicely dressed. They clearly would not dress like this every day. They got dressed up for this photograph. It's his mother, Alice Flato Freund. That would be my great-grandmother. His older brother, George or Georg, and his older sister, Carlotta. Now, again, well-to-do, doing very well. I think Kurt's father was in the clothing manufacturing business in Berlin. Now, one of the curious things about this, though, or about the family, which we'll revisit later on, is that Carlotta and Kurt were both born in Barcelona. Now, a lot of that information I only discovered later on. For instance, I had heard that my grandfather had been born in Barcelona. My father always said that he'd been born prematurely. But when I found Carlotta's birth certificate, that clearly would not be the case. So they must have had a place, as it were, in Barcelona, or had family in Barcelona, and had their children, at least those two, born in Barcelona intentionally. Again, very interesting fact about them. Kurt also served in World War I, fighting for Germany in World War I. Those of you who've studied World War I, very handsome there in his uniform. Earned the Iron Cross second class. He did not see combat, but I learned, my father told me that he was a translator. And my assumption, and I don't know, is that he was translating at least Spanish and probably also French. They would have learned both, or certainly learned French. He may have known Spanish because of Barcelona. And you see his military pass there, which is obviously his actual military pass that he had to carry as a soldier with him. But again, fighting for Germany. Kurt and Annalisa met, I don't know how, but in 1925, they were married. This is the program from their wedding. As you can see, it's a little, well, not faded, but getting a little dark. Very handsome couple, posed. This whole program tells you that they were well off. Nicely done, very nicely done invitation and program on the inside. On one side, it had the list of music that would be played during, and again, it would be played by an orchestra. They did not use recordings back then, during the service. And on the other side, it had the menu for the reception, which was a very long menu and had the wines, the multiple wines that were served with each course. If we had more time, I would show you that, because it's, again, a very interesting glimpse of what life was like for many Germans, but also for German Jews. And again, one of the overarching themes here, which is that German Jews, especially the wealthier German Jews, really considered themselves Germans first. They were part of upper class aristocratic German society, and were accepted at that time as part of the society. They were not kept in a ghetto. These were not lower class, obviously, shtetl, small town Jews from Eastern Europe, like those of you seen Fiddler on the Roof, like those in Fiddler on the Roof. These are the upper class German Jews, very different than Eastern European Jews at the time. Now, um, Berlin in the 1920s was a hopping party in place, for those of you who know. It was like London in the 60s and New York maybe throughout its entire existence. It was a party city, is a way to put it. And here's some kind of party from the 20s. I don't know what it's about, actually. Yeah, I thought I'd skipped a slide, but it's coming up. And you see the women are all in costumes, the men are all in black tie, and they all seem to be wearing exactly the same style of black tie. I have no idea what this event is. I found this picture. It was actually a postcard after my father had died. My grandparents had died. I had no one left to tell me what it was that's going on. And I only found out after I'd had it for a couple of years by looking closely that Kurt and Annalisa, my grandparents, are right there in the center. They don't look like they're having a good time. Everyone else looks like it, but at least they were there. And this is a photograph of them. I assume this is after they were married, so probably the late 20s, although possibly the earlier 20s. Hold on, this is going very differently for me. Anyway, there's my father who came along, Gerhard Freund, he was named. He was born in 1930. This looks like kindergarten, so I'm going to guess it's 1935. He went to a Jewish school. This is a Jewish school. Again, they're all dressed up. I don't know what for. It may be, although I don't think so, the Jewish holiday of Purim, which is the Jewish holiday when you get all dressed up. It may be a European or German holiday that I'm not aware of and that I haven't researched. But anyway, there's my father. Again, this is another photograph I found that didn't say who was in it. And I had to look and go, oh, that's clearly my father there, um, based on the other pictures I had of him. Okay, this is going to go forward and I'm going to have to go back. This is the home they lived in. And there are multiple pictures of multiple rooms in their home. One of many homes they had in Berlin in the 1930s that my father grew up in. These were actually in the city, so these were houses in the city. They had multiple rooms and stairs in a large apartment building in Berlin, in a very nice neighborhood in Berlin called Charlottenburg. And as you can see, again, very well-to-do family, oriental rugs, piano, lace curtains, and lace curtains with fancy designs on them, leather armchair, telephone, which maybe you can see right here, and photographs on the wall. I have both the photograph that's here and the photograph. This mouse is so touchy, so I'm not going to use it anymore. The photograph on one wall and the photograph on top of the piano. If I had time, I would show you those. We actually have those. So they were able to send those photographs eventually. The art that's on the wall, we don't have anymore. And they would have had to leave behind, would not have been allowed to take, and obviously was taken by the Nazis or some other German and disappeared or is on someone's wall somewhere. Some people can trace their art. We don't have enough photographs of their art to try to trace it. But again, one room in one house that they lived in, that my father grew up in. Now, here he is, my father, on the right there with his brother George, my father, the younger one. Again, very looking like, well, I don't know if you call them happy in that upper picture, but that's a very nice photograph of them, and you can tell that they're doing all right. You also see down below the signature says Freund 1935. Now, that is not because of who they are, but because Carlotta, if you remember, my grandfather's sister, so my father's aunt, became a professional photographer and quite a well-known one in Berlin. And that photograph of the inside of the house and all the photographs of the inside of the house was taken by her. And my guess is that the photo that was on their wedding program was also taken by her. Down below, you see them out and about with, again, neither of those are their mother, the women. So they are being cared for by somebody else. I happen to know that the woman in the carriage with my father was named Hildegard, and she stayed with the family throughout most of my father's young life. And the other woman was another governess that stayed with them when they were older. Hildegard, under the Nuremberg laws, I don't know if you studied the Nuremberg laws, don't really have time to go into them. I do have a slide about them. If we have time, maybe I'll go back to it. But one of the Nuremberg laws stated, in its attempt to purify and keep pure German blood, not only prevented marriages and sexual relations between Jews and Aryan race Germans, but German women under the age of 45 to be employed in a Jewish home. It's not said openly, but the fear pretty clearly is that there might be some sexual relations between the father or maybe even the older child with that employee, and therefore any child that came out of that liaison would be why they were not allowed to employ them. And my father always talked about how important Hildegard had been to them and what it was a terrible wrench for him and for the whole family when she was forced to leave. That the entire family was crying very loudly, and it was really an awful thing for them, an awful event, which obviously he remembered throughout his life. The other governess on the right came along later, and with them walking in, that's either the Tiergarten or the Grunewald parts of Berlin, very nice foresty parks that are there. Then come the Nazis, as you've learned, and they come along slowly, starting in 1933. Well, not slowly, but bit by bit. Hitler takes power. The Nazi Party comes to power in 1933. This photo happens to be from 1938. So over the course of quite a while, well, over the course of 5 years, really, the Nazis took more and more power. And very often the photos you see, and you've probably seen, are of stormtroopers, soldiers, or Hitler giving an address, or any of the other Nazi officials. And I wanted to show this picture and the next one to point out that it wasn't just military. The Nazis weren't just taking power in military ways. It was pervasive throughout the country in every single way. This happened to be a celebration. And that car may be, well, we'll be holding at least someone of importance. But the point is to see that the banners were everywhere. And the soldiers you see holding back the crowd in the black uniforms. So it was everywhere. That was the sense that there was in Germany. And it wasn't just soldiers, it was the German citizens themselves. This is them trying to reach out and giving the Sieg Heil salute to Hitler as he passed by in his motorcade. And you can see the love and adoration, and there's no other way to say this. He was sort of the rock star of rock stars for the Germans at that time. And you can see of all age, people reaching out to him, celebrating him, the young men at the bottom trying to hold back the crowds. So again, this was the environment that my father, and his brother grew up in as children. And then obviously his parents were around with too. So they were holding on to be in Germany, but all this was going on. Also what was going on were these cartoons and books that clearly were aimed at children, well, and were aimed at children of one sort or another, whether Jews or otherwise, but mostly at Aryan and Germans. On the upper left is from a lesson as to how to recognize and identify a Jew. And as you can see, the most important thing they're showing, or the most prominent, is the nose, the big hooked nose that all Jews supposedly have. In the upper right, you see one of those hooked-nosed Jews trying to tempt an Aryan, a blonde Aryan with very nice Nordic features, Aryan woman, and tempt her with some jewelry to come along with him. And you are entitled to fill in the rest of what would happen. You see the other Aryan children on the lower right being frightened about that, but obviously being influenced by that. And on the left, you see a Jewish child who is running away, sort of smiling and smirking that this is going to happen. On the lower left is a children's book that was called The Poisonous Mushroom. Jews were seen as mushrooms, as inhuman, not human. And of course, dehumanizing a population is one step on the way to ridding your society of them, and then makes it ultimately easier to murder them in various ways, to kill them, and in the Nazis' case, to exterminate or annihilate the Jewish race, all Jews. So this was a children's book now. It was aimed at German children, but it would have been around everywhere. My father and his brother would have been seeing that around. And again, you see the very stereotypical features of that Jew there. And in the lower right is one of the most awful examples of this, which is a board game called Juden raus, which means Jews out. And the object of the game was to, in rolling the dice, be the first one to get your Jews out of the city. Because the Jews will come in, infecting the city, and then have to be taken out. And you will see the little pieces that are Jews on the top there. And you can tell they're Jews because they're wearing this yellow hat with a grimace and sort of snarl on it, a triangular yellow hat, which is what Jews had to wear in medieval times in Europe, both in Christianity and under Islam, although to a lesser extent, throughout Germany and other parts of Europe leading up to the Enlightenment, at which point Jews were allowed to become part of society, as you saw. But for this game, they were still seen as the dirty outsiders. The yellow hat then became the yellow star later that Jews were required to wear. So again, a board game for children having to do with dehumanizing Jews and leading children on to say, you must get rid of them. They are infecting us, as you see in these other ways. We must rid ourselves of them. This was also going on. And again, this is relatively early. We're moving back a little bit in time. This is 1933, when books were being burned. Books that were all Jewish authors, books were burned, as well as what the Nazis considered degenerate books, which were books that in one way or another did not promote their Aryan values. That would have been communist books or any books that espoused any kind of liberal philosophy or that had any kind of sex or violence in them that they did not approve of. So again, this book burning going on for all Jews in Germany, being aware of this would be happening outside their windows in the streets, and would have been something my father was aware of. Now, again, this was 1933, so it had been very young, but this kind of thing continued on. And as the playwright and poet Heinrich Heine said, when they have burned books, they will end in burning human beings. And he said that or wrote that in a play in 1823. So 110 years before this photograph and before the Holocaust began. So very prescient Heinrich Heine, who would have had his books burned as well, although he would no longer have been alive at this time. Soon after that, my father was, I hope I didn't skip a slide here. My father was forced to carry an ID card, as all Jewish children were. And as you see on the left, there's a very prominent J in there for Judah, for Jew, so that anyone just looking at the card would know that this is a Jew, even though this was a card that was carried by Jews. But again, it was a way for Jews themselves to know that they were marked. This is the equivalent of the yellow star before the yellow star was instituted. This is my father, about the age that he would have been carrying this. I have this exact card, which when I do public or come into classrooms, I can bring with me so you can see what it is like. And again, one of the important things here that I want to point out is that there was a stamp, both the yellow stamp and then the which said Reichmarks, 3 Reichmarks, but the Jews themselves would have to pay for the privilege of having this ID card. And then it was stamped, the ink stamp, by a Nazi bureaucrat. This happened in some office. This is what happened in the offices for all German Jews throughout Germany. So again, it wasn't just soldiers, and it was not even just Hitler and the leaders of the Nazi party. It was the bureaucrats, the people who were running the operations behind the scenes. There was a whole industry, if you will, of gradually and then quicker and quicker eliminating Jews from German life, and also marking them in one way or another as Jews so they could be identified later on, because the Nazis had their plans for the ultimate Holocaust, at least in mind, if not in place, essentially from the beginning. I don't know if you've read any of Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography, but he wrote in the 1920s, in which even back then he talks about the need to eliminate Jews from German life and to eliminate them violently. So this didn't just happen in the 1930s. This was progressing for years beforehand and progressing through bureaucratic means in addition to the violent means. Now, something else part of the bureaucracy is indifferent to the big J. You can see that my father, Gerhard, is now Gerhard Israel Freund. That was not his given middle name. The Nazis required all Jewish males to take on the middle name Israel to more easily identify themselves as Jews, to make sure they understood that they were Jews. And in another way to understand, we are in control of you and your name. We decide what you are called. We decide who you are. And for their sake, we decide what you are, which is the way the Nazis would have thought about it. So again, even in these ways, which may be subtler, you may not see at first, as unfortunate and ugly as this card is, there are all these other ways about it in which it is moving forward with the Nazis' plan for the annihilation of all the Jews in Europe. You may have heard about Kristallnacht if you've studied World War II and the period in Germany before that. For those of you that haven't or haven't yet, Kristallnacht was an organized riot. No other way of saying that. It was on a trumped up reason. There was, or not trumped up, there was a Nazi bureaucrat who was murdered by a mentally ill Jew in another country. And that was used by the Nazis as a pretext to get their populace angry, fire them up, and then not intervene when they went on this rampage. throughout Germany on the nights of November 9th to 10th. I could have included a photo here of the synagogues that were burned. Here you see the result of a synagogue that was burned. So they were burning synagogues, burning other Jewish houses, places, and arresting Jews on the left. And actually before that, as you see on the right, it's called the Night of Broken Glass, obviously for the broken glass. Kristallnacht is actually translated as Crystal Night for the reflections that the glass made. Many of us feel that Kristallnacht, well, that's how it's known historically, is actually almost a euphemism of what it really was, which is a pogrom, for those of you who know what a pogrom is, which is an organized riot, or at least a riot at which the authorities do not step into, do not intervene in. And this happened throughout Germany, not just in Berlin. And Jews on the left were arrested as part of the Night of Broken Glass for days afterwards. And in fact, my grandfather and my grandfather were arrested and taken to the camp known as Dachau, which at that point was really more of a large prison. And they were eventually freed, as many of them were. But as you see on the lower left, the males and the upper class males, the owners of the businesses, Jewish businesses, and the lawyers and doctors and judges who were Jewish were not only arrested, but paraded through the streets in front of the German crowds, which you can sort of see on the right. So a big sort of parade made of it. Another part of the Night of Broken Glass was that the Jews were taxed, were assessed a tax for the cleanup following Kristallnacht. They were considered to be at fault because they were the ones that provoked the German populace to commit these acts. Again, another way for the Germans to say, we are in control of you and we will dehumanize you. And not only that, we're going to bleed you of every single penny you have in every single way we can. Another thing I mentioned, Hitler's biography, Mein Kampf. Every Jewish couple, whether they were married and on their anniversary, was given a copy of Hitler's biography, Mein Kampf. Of course, they had to pay for it. So they were required to pay for a gift of Hitler's biography on their anniversaries. Again, another part that is not actually killing, not putting people under railroad cars and taking them away, not shooting them in pits, but a part of the process. It was at that point that the Jews who had not left before, and there were many Jews who were leaving or trying to leave, as soon as Hitler and the Nazis came to power in 1933, and then increasing and increasing. But it was a Kristallnacht that really made it clear that everyone was going to have to leave, that things were not going to get better. This period was not going to pass, which they were saying to themselves. And again, it was a life that was going to be very difficult to give up for the German Jews. Remember the pictures of the what they were growing up as and the kind of life they had and the houses that they lived in. My grandfather, again, owned a fabric business, and he had that business taken away from him by the Nazis. So all of this was being taken away from them bit by bit, but they still held out hope that it might end, they might get it back. And even so, it was a life that was very difficult. The idea of them picking up and leaving all that behind, and not just their life, but the lives of their grandparents and the parents before them. So a whole long family history in Germany as Jews that they were looking to give up, and which is what made it, one of the reasons that made it difficult for them to leave. The other reason that made it difficult for them to leave, is that the Nazis made it very difficult. They had a whole series of cards. Again, I didn't include them, cards, permits and passes that you would have to get, attesting to the fact that you had no criminal record, attesting to the fact of giving up your business, and giving up all your money, and various other things that they had to give up, signed through these papers that had to be presented all at the same time. They were good for only very short periods of time, and they had different beginning and expiration dates. So if you wanted to get those permits all together, you had to get all of them, make sure they were all together at the same time, valid at the same time, and then go present them to the office in order to get a passport, which is what this is. Again, another way of making life very difficult, but also making it difficult for them to actually leave, to actually get out. And if they were going to get out, they were, and of course, all these documents cost a lot of money that you would have to pay. My family, my father, they were wealthy enough, had enough money to both do all that legally and also to bribe whoever they needed to bribe. I knew that that happened. I never learned any of the specific stories. Both of my grandparents had died before I was older or old enough to start being interested in this and to have asked questions. When I talked to my father about it, which I'll get to a little bit later, he was more or less wanting to talk to me about it. Anyway, this is a passport. This is my grandmother's passport, as you see in the center, Annalisa Sarah Freund. Jewish women were required to take the name Sarah the same way as men were required to take the name Israel. And you can see that there, of course, there's a big red J on it. No way to mistake that this was the passport of a Jew. On the inside, this is my grandmother. Again, remember, stamped. This is all part of the process by bureaucrats. No soldiers involved in any of this. Her children on the lower right, Ernst Georg, who was my father's older brother, and him who was Gerhard at the time. Birth dates. Now, what's very, very interesting about this to me, among the various things, I also have this from my grandfather, is that it was, appears to have been, they appear to have gotten this on the 21st of April, 1939, which was very, very late in the process. As you probably know, the war started in September 1st of 1939, at which point all immigration, all borders were closed. But even before that, again, through the process I just told you about, it was made difficult for Jews to leave. So to be able to get out at this time was very lucky. They were very fortunate for all the reasons I've mentioned. And this was very, very late. It also shows that my grandfather was able to get all those documents together and then able to get a passport for his wife and him, get his children on it, not until April of 1939. And I know they left very soon after that. Managed to escape, if you will. They didn't run across borders. They were able to actually fly first to Holland, and then they took a boat to London, and they were in London for the first year or two of the war, and then finally came to America in 1940. It was a very traumatic year, 18 months to say the least, for the entire family, and especially, as you can imagine, for a 10-year-old boy, which is how old my father was at the time. So again, very narrow window that they were able to make it out with through all these other means, which obviously a lot of other people were not able to do. One of the ways they were able to do it was with this birth certificate. As I mentioned, my grandfather and his sister were born in Barcelona back in 1898, and his sister in 1896. You can see in the upper left, I've circled them where it's the date, 1898. This is a copy of his birth certificate, actually, that he had to get. This was another thing he had to get. Everyone had to get their birth certificate. He would have had to get his birth certificate from Barcelona to present as a document to try to get out. As you can see, I've underlined at the top, it says Kurt Freund and Fleto, his father's and his mother's last names. And down below, from Silesia or Alemannia, which is Germany, Silesia was what became Poland. Again, this was the German Empire at the time. I'm not so clear on my history of the 1890s, but Germany as we know it did not exist. And it said he was living in Barcelona. They were living in Barcelona at the time. Because of that, they were able to qualify on the Spanish quota. Now, the Americans had these quotas. Not only did the Germans make it difficult to leave, but the Americans and others were making it difficult to get in. And they had quotas for how many Jews they would let in. And because of this birth certificate from 1898, my grandfather and his children were number 5 on the Spanish quota. And therefore able to get in. Even though this document's in German, it's from the American consulate in Berlin. Now, if they had not had that birth certificate, as my grandfather's mother didn't, as you see Alice Freund in the top there, they would have, in the red square, been number 69,227 on the German quota on March 13th, 1939. So they would never have made it out. So that birth certificate in 1898 was perhaps the main thing that enabled them to both get out and to get in. Now, as you see, it's actually Carlotta's name on the top one because she was born in Spain too, and she could have qualified. She did qualify to get out. More about that in a minute. So Kurt, my father, was able to get out in 1939 only with his wife and 2 sons. His brother Georg had died fighting for Germany in World War I. His mother Alice was not able to get out. In 1942, was deported from Berlin, this is during the war, to Theresienstadt, a camp in what is now Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, and prisoner number 4246. She died less than 2 weeks later, there, 1942. Carlotta was deported on the 12th of January, 1943 on Transport 26 from Berlin to Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was the death camp as part of Auschwitz. We don't know when she died. There's no record of her. She died either on that train or when she got to Auschwitz and would have been sent straight to the gas chambers. The point I really want to make here is the numbers. The Germans were keeping very close records because they wanted to record every single one of the Jews that they murdered, especially later. They didn't want actually to be shooting people and piling them into pits. They wanted to keep track of however many Jews they actually killed. And these are actual records that were captured later by the Allies following the war. Again, bureaucracy, not just shooting and killing, the whole bureaucracy. Carlotta, these are remembered pages of testimony you can give at Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial, which we bring all our Holy Land Democracy Project teachers to, as Mrs. Kendrick, Dr. Kendrick. I'm not sure what you are, Megan. But this is a way to memorialize them. Now, the picture of Carlotta, she was much older than that. She was in her 40s. I liked that picture. So always wanting to remember that they are 2 people of the 6 million. The Freunds did make it. My father and his family, and try to rush through the last part of it, did make it to America. They certainly were not as wealthy as they were, but they were alive and out. My grandmother was now cooking rather than it being cooked for. My father, as you see in the upper left, was wearing t-shirt and jeans and playing baseball. Very American. And later on, you remember their wedding photograph, Kurt and Annalisa's, where there they are at my father's wedding. In 1956, this was in Connecticut, marriage to my mother. This is my father as I sort of knew him, well, not in the pictures of him as older, really only on the black and white in the upper left and the one sort of in the bottom center. None of those pictures, except for the one of his child, would have been possible without the birth certificate and without everything else, without the wealth that they were able to have and then give up. Um, this is mostly how I remember him, but I always both love and feel a pain in my heart for the boy on the upper right who, uh, even though this was a portrait of him, has that sort of scared look in his eye. And that man you see in the upper left had that boy in him, had all those experiences inside him. Which is important to remember because it stayed with him forever. So there was life. And one of the things I'm most proud of is they're my daughters, Gabriella, the older one. We gave the middle name Annalisa to, in memory of my grandmother. We would have named her Annalisa, except my wife and her mother are named Anne. So we made her Gabriella Annalisa. That's my other daughter, Alexandra. And one of the most proud and moving parts of my life, because I have told them more about this as they grew up, is Gabriella in her Father's Day card. She's older than this now. She's in college. In her Father's Day card this year, wrote to me that she hopes she has girls when she grows up so she can name them Alice and Carlotta, which is perhaps the most moving thing I've ever been, any of them have said to me. It means so much to me. It means that they will not be forgotten. Now, that's really it, what I have. I think, let's see what I have here. Yeah, that's it. So I will stop the screen share. We'll see.
Mr. Freund, thank you so much.
Let me just leave you with two thoughts that I want to leave you with, two important thoughts. One, the Holocaust did not happen. It was done. And it was done to people, by people, and it was done in many, many ways, in addition to the gas chambers, in addition to all the really horrific ways we know. It was done through bureaucracy, and it was done in all sorts of other ways. And the second thing is, even those people who survived, and survived relatively well off, like my father, they left before the war, never saw the inside of a camp. They were still scarred by that. My father had those wounds and his scars for his rest of his life. And there were many ways in terms of his anxiety and his fears and his nightmares, which I could tell you more about if we had time. But those are the real two things. It was done by people. It was done in many ways. And it remained with the victims forever, even those who survived. And therefore, I understand it, and it stays with me. And it also stays with my daughter, even though she is memorializing her ancestors. That's really it. I thank you for listening. I guess we have time for a few questions if you want to do that. So before you have to leave. So what do you think at this point? It's up to you.
Yeah, thank you. That was amazing. I just want to say that, can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. That all of us teachers are kind of chatting together, just saying, wow, this is amazing. This is tying into what we've been studying. This is tying into the literature we've been reading. So all of this is so relevant and helping us just make what we've studied become so much more real. And looking at sort of this microcosm of one family makes history come alive in a very, very real way. So thank you so much for sharing. So students, you're gonna get participation for being here by showing us your notes and questions. However, I do want to invite you in the Q&A section at the bottom to, if you'd like to right now, we have just a few more minutes, to type a question. So I see a couple are coming in, and we will not be able to answer all of them, but while I'm waiting for a few of those questions to come in, and I'll moderate them, Mr. Freund, can you tell me, one of the main themes here is that your family was very well off. We can see the culture, we can see you know, the business that they owned, we can see the lifestyle that they lived. Is it your understanding that in general, those who escaped were wealthy, and then so that economics really had a
excuse me, yes, especially for German Jews and others too. I mean, there were those that were hidden and survived during the war, like Anne Frank, although she did not survive, but others. One of my very good friend's mother was hidden in Holland throughout the war on a farm. So there were people that did that. There were people that managed to sneak out and escape in other ways. There were people like on Schindler's List, who were able to be gotten out through other ways. Um, but yeah, for German Jews, these were the only ways they could get out. I mean, I suppose they could have escaped in other ways, but I think again, to reiterate, and I just want to go back to my father, it was really only as an adult that I began to understand that he was a 10-year-old boy during all this. And when he came to this country, he gave up everything. He didn't actually give it up. It was taken away from him, including his language. He had to come to this country basically knowing very little English. So everything he made of himself, he was a German. He was born a German. And if all of you try to think of yourselves as being 10 years old and having to change and give up everything that you've known, it's pretty awful. Even if you're better off, even if you're wealthy, it's still a ripping apart. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure if that was.
Yeah, it did. Thank you so much. And I'm seeing so many great student questions coming in. A lot of them are asking about, maybe to speak more on that last point you made. How was it to transition to American life? I mean, this is not obviously probably not what they wanted to do. They were so well established in German culture and society, now having to come to the US. Can you comment maybe just a little bit more
It was
on
difficult. My father talked about it as being, it was difficult, but it was also, I mean, listen, he had fun. But for a while, then during the war, it's ironic. A lot of the American kids saw them as Germans and then were blaming them for the war, or blaming them as Jews for the war. So he had to deal with that quite a bit. But he also learned how to play baseball, and he became a fan of the New York Giants, baseball giants as they were. His favorite player was Mel Ott. Those of you who want to look up who Mel Ott was. So he did integrate himself into American life, and eventually very much so. Became a very, not renowned, but sort of a celebrated academic in his way, and then in other forms of life. And I don't know if you remember from photographs, he had cigarettes in his hand. He smoked sort of constantly when I was growing up, and he died from lung cancer at 66. Which is not very old, even though it may seem like it. And his parents, listen, they grew up, we got presents from them, we saw them. Their house, I should say, their apartment in Upper West Side, where you saw the northern Manhattan, where you saw that photograph, had a lot of the same feeling as that apartment that I showed you in Germany. A lot of the dark wood, a lot of the same kinds of things. So they brought as much as they could, at least of the style of that German Jewish feeling with them. Of course, it wasn't the same, but, and again, here's another thing that I find really fascinating, and I have all the other documents I spoke about. They kept it all. They kept all those documents in boxes and suitcases I knew nothing about until my father started showing me them when he was dying. Now, why would they keep all those? I mean, they might have just shoved them away, but they took them with them wherever they moved. And the only way I can think about is because they thought they just might need them again. And another point, I'm sorry, let me go because I forgot this. There's no way of knowing why Carlotta didn't leave herself. You remember, she could have left at number 5. My assumption is that she stayed in Berlin to be able to be with her mother who could not get out. That seems to me the only reason why someone would. And knowing that it was probably her own death sentence. And it was, of course, a death sentence for both of them. But she made that decision, I assume, to stay for her mother. But again, to then leap forward in terms of more contemporary, they kept all of these horrible documents. I'm sort of glad they did because I can do this research and share them. But it's interesting to know why someone would keep all those things.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. All of our students a good majority of our students have done some of their own family history research. So I think this is such a prime example of why, not every family has that, right? That's a real amazing treasure that your family has a set of documents like that. That's a testament to what they went through.
And the photographs, I mean, I'm able to present this kind of history because they kept that. So for that reason, I'm very thankful. I can show my children and talk to them about it. So it is a gift. It's a gift that they're alive. And look, of course, I'm only here because they had to escape. I mean, that's the irony, but that's true for all survivors' children that came here. But that is something that I also think about in terms of the ironies of history and of survival. One thing about Jews too, Jewish people, is we always say that history is always on the table. Our history is always a part of us, and we say we a lot, and we say we suffered because the history is a part of us always. This always becomes a part of us inside. And of course, as I told you, I grew up with a father who experienced this firsthand, and that had some of an experience on me. Now look, I was a boy growing up in Connecticut, so I was fine, but there is still some remnants, at least, of that which passes down from generation to generation. And even when all the survivors have died and gone, the Holocaust will still be alive, if you will, because it will be part of succeeding generations and all those who knew survivors.
On that note, I want to make the announcement that I realize, students, that you may have another math event or another class event at 10:30. So if you need to hop off, you're welcome to do so, but we're going to stay on just for a few more minutes. And of course, teachers, if you have to as well, when you need to jump off, that's fine. But I'm going to hand select a couple.
Thank you, by the way, those of you listening, thank you very much. And I'm always available, even for email questions, if there's anything, phone later on, but thank you.
Excellent, excellent. And if it's okay, I'm going to ask a few more questions for those of us who have a little bit of time to stay.
I have the time. You're the ones with the tight schedule.
Yeah, they all have
their
day scheduled out for them. I'm going to read a question by Kyle Podgorski. He says, first of all, great presentation. So I had a great grandfather who fought in World War II, and I noticed that it was really hard for him to tell us about his experiences. Was it hard for your father to talk about the Holocaust?
Yeah, he really didn't talk about it much at all. He actually, it's ironic, he would talk a little bit when we were younger. One of it, and I should have told you about this, and this was around the time of Kristallnacht, when he was still in a Jewish school. This is very important. He and his brother, they were in the school. He was in kindergarten. His brother was in first grade, something around that age. And they were stormtroopers. This is before the war, showed up, forced all of them to come, told them, you all have to leave the school, made them stand outside in front of the school while it was burned down, while they burned it down. So made them, not only burned it down, but made them stand and watch. So another way of dehumanizing. I can't believe I forgot to include that. That's a really, so it's ironic. He told us a little bit of those stories, which to a child were just kind of like, oh, wow, that's, but I really didn't understand the import of it much more as I was older. So, yeah, it's with you.
One thing that students often ask me.
I'm sorry, did that answer, was it Kyle? Was that answer his question?
I think so, yeah. I would imagine, especially, we see things differently as a child in the first place. So.
Oh, did he talk? It wasn't until actually he was dying. And another ironic, fortunate thing is, if he had died of a heart attack, there's so much of this I wouldn't know. So much. So in that way, the fact that he was dying of cancer and we knew his lung cancer was inoperable, he's dying from, but it gave us almost 2 years, and he would talk about these things. And I bring out the photos and he said, well, that's so-and-so, and that's so-and-so, and that's your uncle this, and that's your uncle, and this is what this document is, and so on and so forth. So he did talk about it more much later. I also had him, I don't know if you know, but Steven Spielberg set up this place called the Shoah Foundation for survivors to give their testimony, as it were. And I had him do one of those, or I connected him so he would do one of those before he died. And that is available. I can go up and see him give his testimony, and I have it. But a lot of it was in there.
Yeah, that's awesome. A lot of our students did 1 or 2 activities on that eyewitness website that the Shoah Foundation has, but I didn't tell them that they could actually just go in and search a name and listen to an entire testimony.
I think they can on some of them. You can find out. It's gone through different iterations, but I believe you can. And again, my father's story doesn't have camp in it, doesn't, for him, loaded on a train, doesn't have him being hid, but it was part of the Holocaust. And as he would always say, it happened in many ways, many, many ways. Also, one other thing, and this is important, as I showed you the photographs of Carlotta and Alice, is that we often hear the number 6 million. 6 million Jews. It's important to remember that each one of those 6 million was a person with a name, and they were killed one at a time, really. They were one at a time put on a train, or one at a time pushed into a pit, even if they were in a group. Again, not very nice to think about, but it's important to remember when you hear that number thrown around, that those were actual human beings with names. And these lives.
A lot of the students are kind of getting here at the question of, how did this happen? And I think you alluded to that. You said this is not just the soldiers. This was not just Hitler directing from the top down, or he was in a way, but there was a larger system here. There was a bureaucracy. There was a resistance in culture against the Jews. But Directo is asking here, do you think any of the Nazis had a change in heart? Were there Germans who did not go along with this? Were there Germans who resisted this form of, or the multiple forms of persecution?
Yes, there were, and there were people in all the countries where the Nazis invaded. There were those who assisted, who hid and helped them. So there were very many people that had a sort of moral fiber and inside to do that. It was obviously a much smaller part of the population. And there were those who resisted in different ways. Hiding someone is different than giving them false papers. It ends up with the same end, but both of those things are dangerous to you as a German or whatever you are. So there were people that resisted in that way. There were people that spoke out and resisted during the Nazi period. In fact, a very interesting movie and story for you was The White Rose. Did any of you study The White Rose? Well, The White Rose is very interesting because it was a society that was all college students in Germany who were resisting the Nazis. They came together, this group, and they were putting out leaflets opposing the Nazis. And they really started a whole thing, or had a whole thing, of college students who were speaking out and resisting the Nazi period. They all were eventually captured and tried and hanged. But Sophie Scholl, Scholl, and The White Rose was an interesting thing. Again, another story you don't hear very much of, but is very interesting. Another thing for you, I don't know if you've studied the Wannsee Conference at all in history, WANNSSEE. That was a conference in 1942 in which a lot of leaders, both soldiers and others, bureaucrats, came together at one conference to actually put into plan what became the final solution. This is what we're going to do with you. This is what we're going to do with you. And they had numbers for every single country in Europe of how many Jews they had. And that's where they really put together the whole system of how they were going to eliminate, and they said this, eliminate Jews from German life and all of life. So Wannsee, WANNSSEE. There's also a very interesting movie called Conspiracy, HBO movie called Conspiracy with Kenneth Branagh and Stanley Tucci, based on that, which all takes place in that conference room. So a number of other things. And I mention those because that's some of the other ways that it happened, both during the war and before the war. Part of it is, you have to start polluting people's minds against the Jews or against your neighbors. You can't just do it all once. And it was harder in Germany because Germans were more assimilated in part of it. It was easier in Poland and those other places where Jews were still separate, or started out separated. And the Nazis started there also in part because less was known by the rest of the world about Poland. And it was only later after the war that they were able to focus their efforts on Germany. But that was always part of the plan. Again, they had a plan. It wasn't just let's gather all the Jews together. That became part of it, ways of doing it. And one of the reasons, and this goes into the Wannsee Conference, one of the reasons the gas chambers were created was they could kill more at a time than they could shooting in pits. They could jam thousands on one train and kill several thousand of them in a day. Also, it was easier on their soldiers. It was very psychologically difficult on the soldiers to be shooting constantly and have all the blood and shooting babies. I mean, they were doing it because that was their orders, their jobs, but emotionally it was still difficult. And the Nazis wanted to spare their soldiers that emotional problem. So making it straight onto the train and straight into a gas chamber made it much easier and more efficient.
I think when maybe one of our previous conversations, you mentioned that that's also an extension of the German industrial complex, right? That Germany was one of the leading industrial powers of the world, and so everything was about efficiency, mechanically, articulated. So it was sort of like, in some ways, part of their culture to use this very mechanical approach to this.
And Germany also was sort of the center of philosophy and art and science in Germany too. So all of that somehow was turned into hatred toward the Jews. But yes, it was an industry, and it's not very easy to say this, but or to hear this, but it was an industry dedicated to creating dead Jews. That's what it was intent on doing, was everything you said. All of this material, the trains, everything else, we're going to put it all together, and we are going to manufacture dead Jews, and we're keeping a quota of it too. And those camp commandants who make more of those dead Jews are promoted more, just like in any other industry or any other corporation. It worked the same as all of that. It just had a much more evil purpose, which again is important to remember, that again, it isn't just shooting. And again, also I have to say, some of that ideology and some of those thoughts about Jews and others, we still see today, unfortunately. It hasn't gone away. The attitudes are still there.
Kaede is asking, what is one thing you want people to understand and remember about the Jewish culture and life? Maybe he says during the war, but maybe before the war, during the war, after the war.
Well, that's a lot. I mean, the most important thing to say is the most important thing, I think, to remember about the Jewish people, which is that we have survived. Jews have survived. We've done everything. We found all the different ways to survive by making ourselves indispensable in ways earlier, and by being part of society, winning Nobel Prizes, whatever it is that Jews have done for themselves has been to survive. And it must be said, creating and fighting for a state of Israel, so that there is always a homeland, always one place where Jews can always go. In terms of other things to remember about the Jewish people, well, that really covers it. I mean, we've always been dedicated to education, above all. In the Talmud, the ancient Jewish code of laws, one of the laws in the Talmud is that you are forbidden to live in a town without a school. And very often when towns were created, the first thing they built was the school. After people's houses, the first public building they built was a school. Because actually synagogue, you can do religious services in a person's house, but they needed a school. I don't know, we're survivors, have suffered a lot, but have figured out ways to survive. We also have obviously depended on the help of others throughout our history.
Do you mind if I ask you a question regarding the book Night?
Yeah.
That's the book I'm going through right now.
Oh, sure, yeah, of course.
With my 10th graders. And there's been speculation that the author perhaps didn't actually live through his book, the stories. Just any thoughts that you have for any of my students that are left on your reflection of the book.
Well, listen, all we have of any history is artifacts and what people say about it, right? That's all we have. Even the largest, most ancient, that's all we have is people's reports and whatever artifacts, like the documents I had and what my father told me. That's all I have, and that's true for any history. I believe firmly Elie Wiesel suffered that. That's what he experienced. He has talked about it enough throughout his entire life. There's records of it that he was there. And that is indicative of what happened to most Jews and many Jews in that camp system. There's also Primo Levi, Primo Levi, who's an Italian Jew, has very similar experiences. He survived, but he wrote a lot about it. There are Anne Frank's experience. So these experiences they have, there are always going to be people that try to deny it, which is another way still doing of dehumanizing Jews and trying to say, look, that didn't happen. When in fact, the Holocaust is actually the best, most documented event of the 20th century. You still have people trying to say it didn't happen and that this is fake and that's fake. I mean, you can say that about anything, without the artifacts and without people's reports. So having heard Elie Wiesel speak and knowing how he has written throughout his life and knowing that it is similar to what other people have experienced, it's clearly true, absolutely true. Now, there have been other people that have faked that have, because they've wanted the attention, who have written reports that were untrue. Those are usually exposed pretty quickly and often exposed by Jewish survivors and victims themselves. So that does happen. That was not the case with Wiesel.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Do any of the young teachers? Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Sure. Go ahead, Vince.
The question I got a lot in my U.S. history course when we went over World War II was Hitler's sheer hatred for the Jewish people. And I know he did a lot of his, the buildup to him coming up with how much he anticipated blaming Jews started when I think he was in Vienna when he was younger.
Yeah.
What led him to believe that the Jewish population was sort of the detrimental perspective to why Germany was in such a rut? Why was
there's lots of speculation. I mean, he talks about it. There's also speculation. First of all, you have to remember in terms of the way things were, you had almost 1,000 years of religious anti-Semitism directed at the Jews. Because the Jews were Christian, because they did this, they wouldn't convert, they all this. I mean, they were ghettoized for 1,000 years. But that was religious anti-Semitism. They could get out of that by converting. Under the Nazi racial idea, Jews were a race, and you can't convert out of your race. And again, that was a quote-unquote scientific approach that comes out of the Enlightenment and comes out of the way Germany is. So there was a way of tapping into that. That already existed. Why? I mean, what Hitler has said, he said about himself in terms of why he was successful. He was able to depict Jews as the enemy. Germany was, again, you may know all this, was in dire financial straits following World War I. As is always the case when people are in dire straits, they need a victim, or it helps to have a victim, a perpetrator, someone that they can point to and say, you're the cause, you're the cause. It's almost always the weakest member of society that is the cause. You don't pick on someone that's as strong as you, you pick on someone weaker. And so very often, especially in Europe, that has been the Jews. So the Jews were seen as responsible for that. And one of the things that's most makes the nonsense, but also shows how much they were victims, that the Jews were blamed for communism, the ills of communism, and blamed for the ills of capitalism. So even these two ideas that were in complete conflict with each other, they were, according to some people, all a plot of the Jews. And that all of this is, everything that's going wrong is a plot of the Jews. So Hitler was able to tap into that And beyond what his personal experiences were, I don't think he's written so much about it. I think there's speculation that, he was in art school and he didn't get higher up in art school. His paintings weren't bought. There was some beef he had with either a Jew or the Jews, and that just mutated like a virus into something inside him that kept going. And then, of course, once he starts becoming famous and becoming a leader, he becomes a megalomania, and that's what's worked for him. So he continues to do it at the same time that clearly he really believes this. In terms of what was really going on, all we have is what he said. And what he said is pretty pervasive nonstop about his hatred of the Jews and blaming them. One of the speeches he gives in 1938 or 39, I think is, I'm paraphrasing, if the Jews manage to plunge Europe into another war, the result will be, these are his words, the extermination of the Jewish race. So he's saying that publicly. You can find that speech from a platform. Now this is close, but he also, listen, he had a lot of people he had millions of people that felt the same way he did, and that were perfectly happy, both as believers or otherwise, to carry out that idea, not just the orders, but to carry out the idea. It's hard to know ultimately why people are the way they are. There's always things in our background that we don't know about. Even people that we live with today. I won't say more than that.
I have a question, if that's fine. In our class, we went over the Holocaust and some of the ills. We also went over people like Nicholas Winton, who also saved a lot of people. I was curious if there are any other organizations or individuals, because today, even when we have, issues in kind of tyrannical countries like North Korea, you get a lot of organizations that try to help move people out. Were there any organizations that tried to aid and protect the Jews from 1933 to 1945? Were there any other organizations that tried to bring people out?
Well, there were individuals. There was Raoul Wallenberg. There was also a Japanese diplomat. I believe his name was Sugihara. They are now starting to be discovered, because it took a while, North African Moroccans who were helping in hiding Jews. So in every country where anti-Semitism really flowered into Nazism, if you will, there were always people that opposed it. Organizations. The Red Cross tried to create some relief. I don't know very specifically other organizations that did that. There would have been some. Again, one of the problems that there were is that there was anti-Semitism in the United States as well. A lot of it, and some of it among Roosevelt's cabinet and his advisors. And a lot of the organizations, even some Jewish organizations, it's terrible to say, didn't want to make waves. They didn't want to make what became World War II all about the Jews, because they were afraid that if that would happen, then the American people would not support the war itself. So, and even Roosevelt, that was the upside down, which is, even though the Jews are the ones suffering the most, we can't make it about the Jews, because then no one will support what we want to do in World War II. And you even have some Jewish organizations that did that. You also there was a plan amongst, I believe it's Stephen Wise and others, to try to buy freedom for Jews, simply to try to raise money and see if they could ransom out Jews from any country they could. I know the Red Cross. There might have been other. I don't know as much, but that's the real answer.
Can I ask a follow-up question sort of on that?
I can do that research and send it to you now.
A student, Carter Hastings, asked, why were so many countries unwilling to accept Jewish people who wanted to leave Germany? And I remember when we were in Yad Vashem, there was a graphic on one of the walls that was about the countries and how many Jews Jewish refugees each country took, and it was a pretty startling exhibit. And I don't recall, you probably remember more than I do.
Well, first of all, there was anti-Semitism in the United States and many other countries, and especially the United States and others. They had always, since the 1800s, not wanted to take Italians, Jews, refugees at all from anywhere. They felt that, listen, it's quite frankly no different than what we hear talked about people south of our border now. They're going to infect our country. They're going to take away our jobs. They're going to destroy our society. That was, again, we can't let these immigrants in because they're going to destroy what we have. There were countries that didn't want to take people in because they were afraid of the result. I mean, in terms of one interesting thing is the movie industry didn't want to make waves and create a lot of anti-German films that dealt with this issue, even during the war. Some did, but not, because so much of their film market was in Germany. So even though these heads of the studios, who were all Jews, the Warner Brothers, Sam Goldwyn, Louis B. Mayer, almost all of them, Adolf Zucker, they were all Jews, who would all of them basically come up poor in one way or another and built Hollywood as we know it. They did not, many of them did not want to make waves because they were afraid of how Germany would react. And that was the attitude of a lot of other countries. We don't want to upset the Germans, at least until the war started, and maybe even as the war was going on, especially until the United States and other countries got involved, which would have been 1941, 1942. And you had a large movement in the United States to say, nope, we shouldn't get involved. We should just be for America. And by the way, we don't want these Jews either. We agree, that was never said out loud, but we agree with a lot of what Hitler is saying and doing about the Jews. Again, Jews often see, like, we're always complaining, we're always victims, we're always this, can't you stop? You're always on and on about the Holocaust. Well, it keeps first of all, it's a part of our history for thousands of years. And in one way or another, it keeps happening. I don't know if you saw, but just a couple of days ago, there are people protesting about the restrictions for coronavirus in Michigan on the steps of the Michigan Capitol, carrying Nazi flags. Look it up in Michigan, because this was all part of a Jewish plot. And because, and this is defiling the white race. It's the same people that were in Charlottesville during that white supremacy thing. So again, it's a minority of people, but they're a very vocal minority, and they have been, how should I say it? They've been not really accepted, but a blind eye has been turned to them more than it ever has been in the past. So it's still there. And there's always this either denial of the Holocaust, or the Jews were actually the cause of the Holocaust because they wanted people to feel sorry for them so they could take over the world. Some version of that.
Which is why it's so important that we hear stories like this. And as we know, that generation that experienced that is virtually, I mean, they would have been very, very young if they're still alive, right? And probably not much memory at all. So it's the generational story handed down that we now have to rely on. So we thank you so much for sharing your story, because it's important for our generations to know and to also recognize stages or indicators of treatment like this, so that we can call it out for what it is, and to the best that we can prevent this in the future.
And it can happen to other people. It's not just Jews. It can happen to other people. And this should also be a lesson or a guidepost for that.
Absolutely. I know that my AP students were each researching genocide in the 20th century more broadly. So there are multiple genocides that were taking place, even now.
What makes the Holocaust different, there are lots of genocides. What makes the Holocaust different is that it was an industry.
Mhm.
It was an industry which other genocides have not been. Still horrible. Genocides are horrible. Rwanda, Bosnia, wherever it was, equally as horrible. The death was huge on a large scale. The Holocaust in Europe was an industry and involved lots of countries.
Jonathan, earlier I had a student ask, and I think he's still here from what I can see, if you could elaborate on what you meant when you said that the Holocaust didn't just happen, more so people made it happen. And I think he might still be on. If there's any way you could go into more detail about
Well,
that.
we often say things like that. You know, well, the Holocaust happened and blah, 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 6 million died. Or the Holocaust happened and this is what happened during the Holocaust. It's really just about the word, is to always remember that these things don't just happen on their own. As we've talked about, you have people with a philosophy and an attitude, and they're putting it into action by taking all these steps. And it takes all these people who are doing it, turning a blind eye to whatever morality they may have, or not having morality at all, being proud of what they're doing, which a lot of the camp commandants and others were very proud of what they were doing. But it's people that do it. It isn't like, you know, it takes people to run an industry. Industry machines don't just run on their own. You know, everything has to be designed, engineered, put together, run, repaired. All of that was going on as part of the Holocaust. And the Germans, even when it was clear they were going to lose the war, once the Americans had invaded Europe, made it into Europe, it was clear the Germans were not. They put a lot of their resources away from the military and towards continuing the Holocaust, killing as many Jews as they could before they lost the war. So that's what's important to happen, is that, sorry, I just said it, important to remember that when people say it happened, just always remember that people did it. Like anything, it's like anything.
Okay, are there any more questions from our teacher panelists?
Yeah, quickly, I see the time. We're actually going to lose this webinar in about, well, maybe in about 3 minutes. We'll
Okay, yeah.
but any last questions?
I want to thank you for your time. As I said before, we've been going through night, and a lot of things you talked about are actually part of a pre-night research project that I had the kids do, or just in discussions that we've been talking about during our live classes. So I think for them, this was extremely informative, and it'll be good for us to touch base tomorrow when I talk to them and just reflect on what you said. So I'm very thankful.
And I want to reiterate that, I mean, obviously, this is important. I enjoy actually doing this because I think it's important and I want to do a good job of it. I'm available either for questions, email, whatever, or at any time to speak this, or hopefully someday in person in classrooms again. So I thank all of you.
Thank you so much.
And I thank all of you students as well. I really, you know, the fact that you pay attention and are interested and are asking questions, it's so important. It's the most important thing, obviously, to pass on this knowledge.
Thank you so much. This has been a highlight, I could say, of our online experience. You know, we're doing our best.
And thank you for putting it all together. I know you guys all moved a lot of classes around for this, and I really thank you for doing that.
Absolutely. We wouldn't miss it. All right. Yeah.